We never know for sure what causes someone to get into politics. Sure, there's the civic duty aspect, but I think more often than not, having power also drives men into politics. And I think it's naive if you don't view it at least this way. You kiss the babies, you promise the moon, you shake all the hands, but all the while, what is lurking deep down is a need for attention, or a belief you can change the world for the better, which is also egotistical. And in the case of our hero, Aaron Burr, his critics will always accuse him of being power hungry, but the truth might be somewhere in the middle, between greed and civic duty. And in the end, doesn't that make an effective politician? Welcome to A History of Losing, Season 1, Buried Alive, Episode 3, Everything is Political. That's how you become a senator! We pick up Aaron Burr's story after the revolution and his early exit. He's become something of a legend in the New York courtrooms, and as his popularity as an attorney in New York grows, people start to see something more in him. Local voters at the time saw something in Burr's charisma in the courtroom, not to mention his war record and his familial stock. He's the son of Aaron Burr Sr., remember, founder of Princeton University, and the grandson of Jonathan Edwards, fire and brimstone Puritan preacher. So without trying, he appears like this perfect candidate. So the Democratic Republicans court him, and he doesn't even seek out the votes. The actual voters send him to the New York General Assembly in 1784, and he serves in the lower house. He doesn't even run. Now, consider state legislatures at the time. It's not like today where everyone is interconnected across state lines. So much more power at this point, at the infancy of the nation, rested in the state because the federal government was really just a foreign power at this point. Right after the Revolution, the former colonies still had the Articles of Confederation, that loose alliance, and at this point, the Founding Fathers tried to decide where the federal government stood in the new nation, and that left the states to figure out the nitty-gritty details of life in the new states. And to make it even more convenient, the New York General Assembly convened just down the street from Burr's law office. It was great exposure for the young attorney, and when we look at the records of his first session, that's really all it was to him, exposure. He doesn't write any legislation, and he barely votes. But in the second session, he does something radical. Burr spearheads a bill to immediately abolish slavery in New York. And it is a bit of hypocrisy. He abhors the practice of slavery, but like many people at his time, that doesn't stop him from owning slaves. Keep in mind, this is generally pretty common for that era. Politicians attack an issue with hostility, but they don't really follow through on their personal end. And this is actually the case for both he and his rival, or soon-to-be rival, Alexander Hamilton. So here's what happened. Lawmakers introduced a bill for gradual abolition in New York, and Burr seized the moment and crafted an amendment to end the practice for good with the signing of the law. But to do this, he had to take the debate to the legislature floor. He fought, he lost, and gradual abolition of slavery passed, only to be vetoed by Governor George Clinton. It's a loss that gives Burr an idea of the political landscape. And it's from this second session that Burr emerges as a politician who makes it difficult to see where his allegiances lie, even when we look back now. In a time when George Washington is condemning political parties, his surrogates, Hamilton, Jefferson, Madison, they're sowing the seeds of this two-party system, and Burr, who has always disagreed with Washington, ironically aligns with him at this point. It's that sort of hidden loyalties where the idea that Aaron Burr burned with an unholy ambition for political power began. I mean, even if he did, I think it's worth this question: is it really any worse than his contemporaries? Probably not. The only difference being that he doesn't leave behind any writings to preserve himself in history the way Hamilton did or Jefferson did. The rise to political power, however, comes completely organically to Burr. While serving in the legislature, political foe Governor George Clinton, the man who just vetoed the abolition bill, sees something in the man he calls Little Burr, and Governor Clinton ultimately will have a hand in sending Burr to the forefront of the new nation's politics. It'll be the first major shots fired in the Alexander Hamilton-Aaron Burr rivalry, pun intended. And it's just one of the many times their paths will cross, but this story, right here, this is how Alexander Hamilton made Aaron Burr a senator. Around this time, 1789, Burr and Hamilton stood together. Probably not by choice, but by fate. And they both opposed the anti-progressive, constant incumbent Governor George Clinton. Clinton, by the way, at this point, is a 3-term governor since the new nation started. And he doesn't want to leave his position, and he doesn't plan on changing politically. Now, Hamilton obviously prefers the Federalist candidate, and Burr prefers a more moderate anti-Federalist candidate, but both men have one goal in mind, that's to get Clinton out of office. So the two men sought to bring him down through canvassing in the springtime. They give speeches, they write op-eds, anything they can do to get the people's attention about what's wrong with the old incumbent. Ultimately, they fail. And that's definitely one way to look at it. Governor George Clinton begins his fourth term despite their efforts. But there is another way to look at it. His victory was so small, Clinton knows he can't survive another tight battle. Not to mention, Burr and Hamilton's efforts actually put Federalists into high-ranking positions around him. Clinton may have won the battle, but right now he was looking at a losing war, so he did what any good politician does. He switches teams. As soon as George Clinton has an opening in his administration, specifically Attorney General, he asks Colonel Burr, the young up-and-coming attorney, to join him. Burr vacillates at first, but then he agrees to accept the position. Who knows the overriding reason why the old incumbent chose Burr? Probably no one, but it remains that he sees something in Burr that causes him to reach out and bring him over to his side. So there is some general worth. It's not just us speculating. We can see through history that people see things in him. And in fall of that year, Aaron Burr takes over as Attorney General of New York. Burr finds a young state that's dealing with these after effects from that costly war. Yes, we won the American Revolution, but there are war debts. There's back pay for soldiers. There's borrowed funds that now face a deflated currency. The list of problems goes on. And the number one issue, though, is there's no system to reconcile war debts. So Burr and two other lawmakers set it up. The rubric they use for arbitrating post-war concerns finally brings some level of settlement to the patriots of New York, the people who spent money because they believed in the war, and it's the first time they've seen this since the new nation started. Clinton keeps an eye on Burr, and he isn't finished with him yet. He has other plans, and he has one that drives right at the heart of Burr's temporary ally, Alexander Hamilton. What happens next is important, because it could be the cause of that great divide, that fatal divide between Hamilton and Burr, and the first seeds are sown during an election for the first senators of New York. Before we get there, let's take a look back at the early power structure of the state of New York. In 1788, the state ratifies the Constitution, and along with it comes the election of the first federal officers for the bicameral legislature we know as Congress. Now, in New York, power flowed through three families, a triumvirate: the Schuylers, the Clintons, and the Livingstons. And in those opening years, the power swing seemed to favor anyone the Schuylers and Livingstons supported. Simple math, any candidate that the Schuylers and Livingstons support beats the one power family, the Clintons. So in the summer of 1789, it's kind of a foregone conclusion that the Federalists will represent New York in the Senate. And at the time, the New York legislature chose the senators, so it was more of a selection than an election by a Federalist General Assembly. Now, the first two senators chosen are the old patroon, as he goes by, Philip Schuyler, and Rufus King. And Schuyler is the head of the Schuyler family. And if you've seen Hamilton the musical, he is the father of the Schuyler sisters, and he is the father-in-law, therefore, of the Federalist Party leader Alexander Hamilton. In those first years, the Livingstons and Schuylers aligned in the Federalist corner, and most times the Clintons went on the common man limb by themselves. But party lines weren't so obvious back then. In fact, they didn't even have a name, so we sort of posthumously can examine them now. But it wasn't unheard of to reach across party lines or family lines. And while Schuyler Livingston had brought the first two senators from New York to power, one simple tip could turn one of the families into George Clinton's camp. After the 1789 election, one of the two senators would have to serve a 2-year term. Senators serve 6 years, but in that first Congress, in order to stagger the terms, some of them would have to do 2-year terms. So Philip Schuyler was chosen to serve that shortened term, and at this point it was a foregone conclusion in 1791, when he was up for re-election, the two families would send him back to the Senate. That's how it seemed. But what he didn't know was that his son-in-law, Alexander Hamilton, had sabotaged him before his term even started. This goes back to that election, the first one in 1789. The Livingstons wanted to see New York City Mayor James Duane go to the Senate, and Hamilton didn't want that. He wanted Duane to remain the mayor of New York City. So, acting as the Schuylers' political mastermind, Hamilton goes behind the back of Robert Livingston, the patriarch of the Livingston family, and he throws the family's support behind Rufus King, a loyal Federalist. He felt, in his infinite wisdom, King was better suited for the role, and the Livingstons, unbeknownst to them, didn't know this was happening. They're caught completely off guard. And the head of House Clinton, George Clinton, sensing an advantage through intrigue, throws his support also behind King. So King wins with a Schuyler-Clinton backing, and he goes to the Senate. James Duane goes back to New York City, and Robert Livingston fumes and waits for political revenge. And now, Clinton has become a worthy ally. So we go back to 1791, and a new alliance is formed behind the Schuylers and Hamilton's back. They don't know about it. Robert Livingston leads his followers out of the Federalist camp and into George Clinton's fold. And their first act was almost as symbolic as it was practical: throw Philip Schuyler out of the Senate. But who would replace him? Who could replace the old patroon? That was a bit of a mystery, and it wasn't revealed until the week of the vote, enough for Hamilton's supporters to call it a conspiracy. Here's what happened from Alexander Hamilton's perspective. He does what he thinks he's supposed to do. He presents the legislature Philip Schuyler to continue as a senator. But that's when this secret alliance hits back. The motion to vote Schuyler back to the upper house dies in a vote. The motion, not even a vote, the motion itself. And then in a shock to the Federalists, the name chosen for the nomination on the floor is Aaron Burr. The motion passes, then the vote, and in a single afternoon, shockwaves rip through the Empire State that will change the balance of New York political power, and Burr is now a U.S. Senator. But how did it happen? How did a New York lawyer and lawmaker rise to senator without a foothold in either of the three power families? It's really not known who developed the plan first. Was it the Clintons? Was it the Livingstons? Or did Burr approach them? It's hard to tell. But here's what we do know. Aaron Burr's political leanings may have been unknown, but he himself was not. Even Federalist Nathaniel Hazard said of Colonel Burr, he, quote, has an address not resistible by common clay. The charming, well-known attorney had laid down his best work in the weeks before the vote. Now, around this time, Governor Clinton let it be known that he had a replacement for Aaron Burr as Attorney General, should he step down, sort of a signal to the young politician that he could do more with his life. So Burr spent the time leading up to the vote for the Senate entertaining members of the General Assembly. He canvassed for voters on the floor of the Capitol, and the Livingstons and Clintons did their part and threw the family support quietly behind them. In fact, it may have been a shock only to Hamilton and Schuyler and their hubris that Burr succeeded Schuyler. It's hard to exactly know when the venom between Hamilton and Burr began, but this episode certainly looks like an obvious genesis. Philip Schuyler, for his part, complains about the role he suspects Burr played in overthrowing him. He doesn't even seem to at all be aware that his crosshairs need to be on the man truly responsible for his loss, the man who overplayed his hand, Alexander Hamilton. And like an egotist, Hamilton won't blame himself. From here on out, he attacks Burr, and you see at times daily attacks on Burr. Each attack can be different, but they have one common theme. Burr is overly ambitious and dangerous. But once again, what politician isn't ambitious? And here's another theme to their rivalry. Aaron Burr has no inkling of Hamilton's rage. He leaves for the capital of Philadelphia, oblivious to the fury. And that's really not a huge surprise to people who know Burr. Biographer Milton Lomas reports that later in life, even Andrew Jackson could see that Burr rarely paid attention to rumors or attacks to his character. The quote is, Aaron Burr is as far from a fool as I ever saw, and yet he is as easily fooled as many I ever knew. He has no idea the political forces will conspire in a focused manner on him from this point on. And if he had, he might have sought safety in the coalition that brought him to the Senate, the Clintons and the Livingstons. But, and this might be hyperbole at this point, Burr does have one single allegiance that it seems to be a constant theme throughout his political life, no matter what his rivals say, and that's democracy. In the Senate, he shows a belief in the power of the people, not in the power of political elites to decide the future. So when he gets to the Senate, he throws himself into his work, and he has a good reason, because at the time, the first love of his life is dying. During Burr's Senate term, his wife Theodosia's health gets worse. She's been sick most of their time together, but in 1794, she dies. And modern historians believe it was breast cancer, and from her symptoms, it certainly seems like cancer of some sort. And years from now, their daughter will show the same maladies and symptoms, so it's likely that it was breast cancer. So, his only love is dead, and he's left alone again, like he was left alone by his parents and by his foster families. So Burr concentrates on shaping the nation from his seat in Congress. Lomas in the biography shows at a glance Burr's voting record is that he voted with the party of the people, the Republicans. but he refuses to stand with the party or be counted as a member. He simply represents in his mind, and he writes about this often, the interests of the people of his state. When Burr arrived in the nation's capital, the Senate was a closed session, so there are no records of the speeches made on the floor, we just have the votes. And it seems like immediately he began to distance himself from the Livingston-Clinton alliance. Reports from eyewitnesses reveal a great orator in the chamber, but a man who refuses to follow political lines being drawn all around him, and seemingly no one can really tell what camp he's in. But here's something you can tell. His vote leans heavily towards spreading suffrage, increasing the voice of the people, and giving them a look inside at how the sausage is made. Burr and his fellow New York Senator, Rufus King, pushed to open the doors of the Senate to the people, to literally allow the public to sit in on the chambers as they debate. And he also tries to write the people's history of the American Revolution. He will go to his death saying the true heroes who moved the needle in 1776 have been overshadowed by men more focused on posterity than the truth. And here's kind of a neat thing. Before the Senate convenes each morning, you could have found the young senator in the State Department archives. He's compiling a true history of the Revolution, and he spent those first 5 hours of the day studying notes, letters, and narratives of the war, and he peeked into the young nations dealing with foreign leaders. For the first few months of 1791, Burr is what you want in a politician. He has a thirst for knowledge, he's a hero for the people, and then an old nemesis creeps back into the picture. To most historians, George Washington is not only the greatest, or at least up there, president, he's the standard bearer for what we measure the commander-in-chief by. But to Aaron Burr, he's a conniving, paranoid obstructionist. Now, after initially getting Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson's permission to use the archives, Washington personally bars Burr from the archives without warning. Jefferson offers no explanation other than he sends him a letter that says, quote, "It has been concluded to be improper to communicate the correspondence of existing ministers." It's no wonder who decided that. The heavy hand of His Excellency stepping in to squash Burr's work. Still, he is a United States Senator, and he can vouch for the people. In Philadelphia, it is true that you can't tell which side Burr aligns with. Despite his contemporaries drawing lines in the sand and they say, "I'm a Federalist" or "I'm a Republican," Burr routinely shows contempt for labels. It's this view of him that Hamilton uses to barrage him with insults in the press. Power-hungry, ambitious. "If you stand for nothing, Burr, what will you fall for?" That's Lin-Manuel Miranda in Hamilton the Musical, but that's just a myopic view from Hamilton. Shame on Broadway for continuing the stereotype, because Burr does have a constant record of pushing forward any legislation that empowers the common man. He just doesn't want to pick a side. Here's an example of how we kind of see history differently. In today's history, we learn the importance of Hamilton's United States Bank. It relieved war debts, it established international credit, and it created currency. But it wasn't a popular idea at the time among the working class, the common clay, who were building this nation. Think about it. Who has the money to benefit from banks? Who could take out loans? Who could finance business ventures? Merchants, Federalist politicians, basically everything modern progressives despise, and ironically love the play about him. The bank had the potential to create a caste-like economic system, and to make it worse, this was one that could be politically driven. That dream of the yeoman farmer or the blacksmith rising through the classes was a fantasy concocted through history. The equal playing field we pretend existed at some point didn't start that way. If Hamilton's bank really was that good for the people, then he would have been on board with a certain Burr bill. See, Aaron Burr proposed an amendment to the Constitution to forbid politicians from owning stock or working in any institution that issued U.S. currency. And it fails because all the Federalists oppose it. But he goes on to maintain separation between the government branches. He writes legislation that attempts to restrict the executive branch from openly criticizing Republican, also called Democratic, societies. The dirty secret was the first president really wasn't opposed to political parties, just the opposition to his decrees. But his biggest stand is against an unpopular treaty, and Burr makes his case for America by fighting the Jay Treaty. What is the Jay Treaty, right? Well, around 1793, the British policy towards U.S. sailors and ships turned to one of impressments. Not just the Navy, but merchants as well could be forced into unlawful search and seizures on the high seas. And eventually, this is going to lead to the War of 1812. But in 1794, President Washington had enough, and he sent John Jay to deal with the British. And right off the bat, this upsets Burr, because he thinks John Jay is the least qualified to negotiate with the British. And he's probably right, because when Jay returns, the treaty turns Republican stomachs. In the most basic of terms, the Jay Treaty conceded that the Navy that ruled the seas has jurisdiction. That's it. no freedom of the seas. In exchange, the British agreed to leave the forts in the United States, ones they'd already promised to abandon post-revolution. This was like a blackmail treaty to Americans, and in the end, the British went back to the policy of impressment anyway. Burr, furious, storms through the Senate chambers opposing the treaty. The vast majority of America agrees with him. Hamilton, conversely, was pelted with stones for giving a speech in support of the treaty in his own backyard on Wall Street. Now, we forget because his good name has been lost to history, but Aaron Burr became a household name in the United States during this time. Newspapers carried his name across the country, and especially back in his home state. However, in a time when the country is dividing into two political camps, he hasn't chosen a political house to reside in, and that's when he gets voted out of the Senate. In 1797, after his first term, he's ousted from the Senate by a newly reinforced Federalist Confederation. They send the old patroon, Philip Schuyler, back to Congress, and it's obvious he upset the Federalist order. By 1798, Burr is back in politics, and this time, back in the New York legislature. Now, it's from this delegate seat, just a delegate seat, he will plot a complete overhaul of the United States political system through a bank you still may use today. And from that position, he will also make a bid for the highest office in the new country on the next History of Losing.